In yesterday's webinar, we discussed strategies to manage cattle rations in light of the cutbacks and slowdowns in the ethanol industry, including limited supplies of corn co-products for beef cattle feed. The recording of that event is available, and we'll share with you the link to that recording at the end of tonight's session. So tonight's session will relate to strategies for holding or slowing the growth of cattle to manage our way through the packing plant closures and slowdowns. Last week's federally inspected cattle slaughter was 27% below a year ago, and reports are that about 10% of the harvest capacity in the U.S. is offline. As you are probably aware, yesterday President Trump announced an executive order under the Defense Production Act to keep the plants, to open plants and keep them open. These openings will be with an enhanced worker protection and distancing, so that line speeds will be slower than normal for some time. So this series of webinars is brought to you by the Iowa Beef Center at Iowa State University, the Iowa Cattlemen's Association, and the Iowa Beef Industry Council. So I'm Dan Loy, Professor of Animal Science and Director of the Iowa Beef Center. I've also served as Extension Beef Feedlot Specialist for Iowa State University for several years. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Dan Thomson. Dan is the Department Chair for the Department of Animal Science at ISU. He started on March 23rd, which was the day we closed the campus and moved everything virtually to working virtually. So he's had quite a tumultuous start with his return to Iowa after many years in Kansas and at Kansas State University on the faculty there. So tonight's format will be that Dr. Dan and I will tag team a few introductory comments to set the stage with some background information on nutritional information, some of the tools we have to make decisions about this process, as well as health and welfare concerns for heavy cattle in the feedlot, especially in the summer. And then we'll once again have a panel discussion with our excellent nutritionists from Dustin Puhrmann and Dave Rueber. Dave, both of these are two boots in the barn or boots on the ground nutritionists from Northwest and Northeast Iowa, respectively. So we'll have a good discussion with them for the bulk of the evening, and then we'll open it up to questions from you. So feel free to type questions in the chat box or the Q&A anytime. Beth Reynolds, our IBC program specialist and our host for this evening, will also be monitoring those questions. So let's get started. So just as kind of an introduction, cattle weights have been increasing. They've been increasing from some time. This is aside from the current situation. So each year we've been monitoring and watching this steady increase in carcass weights. So carcass weights increasing is nothing new, but certainly this trend line that you see here looks like it appears to be continuing. And all indications are that given the current situation, we're likely to be very much above this trend line in the future, or in this current situation. And as we increase carcass weights, there's a cost associated with that. Dr. Garland Dalkey, who's in our shop, had the opportunity to model some of the recent closeouts that we get through our feedlot monitoring program, and do some modeling on that and look at what the incremental feed conversion is as we go to these heavier weights. And so just to look at this particular chart, if you look at the 1,600 pound steer, given these recent closeouts, that steer to put on that 1,601st pound will take about 10¼ pounds of feed dry matter per pound of gain. And that continues to increase as an increasing rate as you get heavier. Now, the 1,700 and 1,800 pound weights, that's beyond the scope of our data. So we really don't know from this analysis what it looks like, but we know it will be higher. So there's a cost associated with holding cattle to heavier weights, even if we're not trying to slow them down. And of course, that will exaggerate that as well. The good news is the net energy system works, and cattle nutritionists know about the net energy system. It's the basis for all of our growth models that we have in the various computer software programs across the United States. And we have a lot of experience using that to predict performance of beef cattle and also program and develop predicted performance for beef cattle as well. And so nutritionists have the ability to predict average daily gain and weight based strictly on their feed intake. We have experience with software where monitoring current performance just based on their feed consumption and the net energy of the feeds on a daily basis. We can predict their final weight by 1%, within 1%. So nutritionists can project performance using various tools that are available, and they can also program the rate of growth. I have a lot of experience with programmed feeding, backgrounding programs, using this technology to stage cattle in the backgrounding program coming into feedlots. Now we're looking at potentially using the same technology and tools to program cattle on the backside. So this is just an example. Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions that go in this chart, but I put this together just to kind of put the basic concept into perspective. And so bear with me a little bit as we go through this, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about this. So the column on the right is a normal upper Midwest finishing program. So this is a feedlot ration that's 63 to 65 mega cows. That's how the nutritionist would typically describe this ration. So this would be a typical feedlot ration that would be somewhere around 10% roughage, for example. Okay. So we move over to the left two columns to this background column. This is a backgrounding ration that's a 50 to 55 megacal ration. So this might be 50, 60% concentrate, 40 to 50% roughage. This is a ration that we might use in a backgrounding yard to try to program cattle before coming into the feedlot. Cattle in this situation would gain 2 to 2.25 pounds a day. This column in the middle is a conservative finishing ration. And this would be, for a lot of feedlots, this would be your step-up ration. But for some feedlots, they're very conservative in their approach. They want to feed something like 20, maybe 25% roughage in their ration. This would be a typical ration that might fall in that category. So in terms of slowing cattle down, one of the common approaches, or one of the approaches I would expect a cattle feeder to do, is just back down a ration or two rations from their step up to something that looks like this conservative finishing program. And assuming these cattle, and these were about 1,300 pound cattle, continue to eat 25 pounds of dry matter a day, that will decrease the number of pounds those cattle will gain over a 2 month period by somewhere around 35, 40 pounds. Okay. The problem with this is I've seen enough studies through the years where we fed different levels of roughage to finishing steers from 7 to 8 to 10 to 15 to 20, maybe even up to 25, where the cattle that are on the higher roughage ration just eat more feed and gain the same. So if we do use this approach, we're going to have to moderate their intake and manage that as well. I should also add that there's also another column if you're outside of the Midwest, and that would be the steam flake corn rations. When you get about west of the eastern third of Nebraska, you see mostly steam flake corn diets, and in that case, we'd be looking at levels of 68, 70 NEG, so a little higher energy, but probably a lower feed intake compared to what we're looking at here. And so they may have a different strategy there because it may be more difficult to feed higher levels of roughage like we might be advocating here. So on the left is a maintenance ration, 30 NEG. So this would be a ration where we're going to just maintain their current weight. We're used to doing this. We winter beef cows all year on a ration that looks like this. This is basically an average to below average quality hay diet. So we can maintain cattle at the current weight. The problem is with steers, they're probably still growing in muscle and bone. And so if we just maintain their weight, they're going to lose some fat and probably some marbling. So there's a cost to this. And I think this would not be something we would advocate, but if you're desperate and in terms of holding off for a market, it can be done. And we have the ability to do that. I think one of the things we might consider if we really want to slow the cattle down and still have the cattle growing at a rate where they're depositing marbling is going to this backgrounding ration for finishing, one where we're still maintaining 2 to 2.5 pounds a day. In that 60-day period, we're still going to put on 100 to 150 pounds. I calculated 135 pounds here, but we'll slow that rate down. We'll still be producing quality beef by the time those cattle get to market. This is not too much unlike the way my grandfather fed cattle or the way cattle were fed when I started this career, where they were fed very, very high levels of corn silage. A lot of this information is in a fact sheet that we put together along with our counterparts at the University of Wisconsin who are interested in this because of slowdowns and closings in Green Bay, where we market a lot of Holstein cattle. And so that fact sheet is available in this link. So that was just a little bit of background. So just to kind of summarize, and one of the things that's also important along this is that if we feed the cattle less energy, they may just eat more feed and gain the same. So we also need to control the intake. So limited or managed intake programs should also be considered if we have the bunk space and the bunk management to allow that. Marbling will be continued to be deposited if we can maintain that minimal daily gain of 2 to 2.5. So that, I think that's kind of what we might advise you to do if you have the room to do that. We can put cattle on a maintenance ration or a weight loss program, but it's really not advised unless you're desperate, and there's really no other options to do that to hold off for a particular market. And the other thing is that there's health concerns that exist when we feed heavy cattle. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you take over for the next few slides.
Great. Well, thanks for allowing me to be here. It's great to be back in Iowa and back home. For reference, I graduated high school in Clearfield, Iowa, and was born in Creston, so you kind of know where my geography is from. But anyway, when we start to think about late day health issues, you can go to the next slide, Dan. The big one that kind of hits us with these longer day cattle in the summer are atypical interstitial pneumonia, and you can see this heifer here. And one of the things about AIP is we've seen it more prevalent in heifers. It occurs more in long day cattle, and it occurs more in the summer. And there's a lot of different theories on why we see this, from pathogens, septicemia, dust interactions, heat stress, all the above. But you can see on this microscope slide, on this particular slide, the lungs, or the histopath where it says 4X, is what normal lungs look like. And the lungs on the right side there, 1X, is what we call atypical or acute interstitial pneumonia. And the clinical signs of this, next slide. So this is our epidemiological curve, and this is from Production Animal Consultation, which is a consulting group that I belong to. You can see that when we look at our AIP cases, most of our AIP mortalities occur out there at about 150 to 160 days on feed. Next slide. You can also see from this graph, as I already mentioned, that most of our AIP deaths occur during the summertime or when it gets hot. So we'll see them more in June, July, August. This is a typical presentation of atypical or acute interstitial pneumonia, or AIP. You'll start to see when you start to see this sway back, and you start to see the animals with they'll start to bow out in their front legs. They have a terrible time exhaling because their lungs are so overinflated and full of infiltrates that these animals, as you saw in that slide, where it's supposed to be spots for air, this animal actually has fluid. And so when they're trying to, you'll hear the expiratory grunt. They'll and a lot of these animals will die next to the water tank because they're so out of breath and in such acute respiratory distress that they can't even stop to take a drink. And we deal with these animals, but again, it's more common in heifers, summertime, and longer day on feed. Next slide. This is on the necropsy. You can see what the lungs would look like. You can see how overinflated. When you pull the AIP lungs up out of a carcass of a calf necropsy, they'll weigh 3 or 4 times more than the normal pluck. and they'll be 3 or 4 times the size. Matter of fact, when you open it up and you feel that, they say they describe the feeling of the lungs feels like a bag of marshmallows. And when you do a cross section of those lungs, you'll hear your knife kind of drag as if it's coming across a lot of meaty tissue in those lungs. And it's pretty easy to see this. It'll be across the entire spectrum of the lungs. So it's different than respiratory disease, where we usually just see it in the front and the bottom half of the lungs. This will be from front to back, top to bottom. Both sides of the lungs will be affected. Next slide. We used to think, well, this is caused by one thing. Maybe it's MGA, or we thought it was caused by just dust, or it was just caused by, you'd pick something. And we thought we could solve it with treating with aspirin or preventing it with more vitamin E. And what we found is in human medicine, there's a syndrome called acute respiratory disorder. And this acute respiratory distress has 60 different known causes in humans. The big ones are sepsis, so animals that had BRD before that potentially have an issue with bacterial showering into the lungs. Aspiration, whether it's rumen fluid or water, and you start to think about having lacking water tank space, and you think about animals that are around the water tank in the summer, how do they get their turn? While their buddy's taking a drink, they sling their head and hit them in the gut, and they inhale water. And so aspiration of water can create it. Dust and heat stress. In sheep, we have a model at the University of Kentucky Medical School that we can put these sheep in heat stress and then expose them to cotton smoke. They will have AIP. And study it in human medicine. And so when you start to think about dust and heat stress in the summer, and so that's one of the things we have to do. Remember, if you're feeding calves and we're holding them longer, we're going to have more dust, because if we're holding cattle longer, we're not cleaning pens out as often. And if we don't, the only way to prevent dust is to harvest the dust and get rid of that manure coming out of winter. And if we don't do that, we're going to see higher amounts of dust plumes. If we're limiting intake, those animals could get more aggressive at night. And so there's some things that you have to watch and you have to prepare. The next slide. And I'll just say this, there is no treatment for AIP. You can hear people tell you that you should use Lasix to get the fluid off the lungs. You can hear about different miracle mycins and things of that nature. And I'm just telling you, there's about a 50% case fatality rate. The best thing you can do on an animal that truly has AIP, if you have a local locker that'll take it, is take them in, because they won't be condemned, because it's a non-infectious issue. Two other things that I'll mention quickly, as Dan mentioned, with animals getting bigger, the two main things we see are bruising on carcasses and fatigued cattle syndrome. Next slide. As these animals get bigger, and you start to think about how these are some cattle that were on feed over 700 days. Okay, they're Wagyu cattle, and this is a picture of one of them from the beginning, and then 700 days later, and you want to start to have heart palpitations. You think about all this 2 years of work that you've done on feeding these calves, and now we're going to wreck it all in the last 5 minutes as we take them to slaughter, or as we take them from the home pen to the loadout on the truck to the packing plant. Next slide. We have seen bruising on cattle because of their height and their hip height. And so one thing you need to make sure is that when people are hauling your fat cattle, that one, they have a trailer that is built for fat cattle, and preferably that they've had the modifications so that the animals don't catch their tail head as they jump to go down into the belly. Merritt and Wilson trailers both can have the modifications done for $2,500 that extends the top deck forward and puts the top deck loading ramp to a flip up to the side rather than being put up underneath the top of the lower deck. The other thing to prevent these animals from bruising is to slow them down going on the truck. The faster they go on the truck at a higher rate, the more they jump trying to get in, and the bruising is more severe. Next slide. Another problem that we have with animals that are going to slaughter is fatigued cattle syndrome, and I can just cut to the chase on this. With fatigue, as we get bigger cattle, heavier and more finish on these cattle, the thing that we see is when we take these large cattle in heat stress situations and we run them around the home pen to get them out, and we don't take our time to get them out of the home pen, or we run them from the home pen to the loadout, we can then see issues when they get to the packing plant. Next slide. We remember in 2013, these are the cattle in Pasco, Washington. This is a picture of them that presented at the plant. They had muscle tremors. They were reluctant to move. Some of them slipped their hooves. But the big thing is with fatigue cattle syndrome, this isn't due to an injury. This isn't due to joints. This is due to the animals being overstressed, heat stressed, and just exhausted physically to when we move them. Next slide. This is a slide with athletes. Now we're measuring lactic acid or lactate. And if you remember your first day of football practice, or you remember the morning after your first day of football practice trying to get out of bed because you were so sore because of the lactic acid that built up, we monitor lactate levels. And the more exhaustion that these marathon runners or bicyclists have, the more lactate builds up in their muscles. And you won't see the problem at the feedlot, but after the animals ride on the truck and they unload, that's when they stiffen up. Have you ever gone out and worked and picked up bales, got in your truck, drove home, and when you get home, you can't hardly get out of the truck because you're so stiff? That's what these steers are going through, and they can't move, and they get condemned at the plant. This is an athlete here. Dan, if you hit the next picture, that is not an athlete, okay? This is somebody that we've put in a hotel room. We have put them on a high caloric diet, all you can eat with room service. We've gone through once a day and asked, are you doing okay? And they're like, well, I have kind of a stuffy nose. So we take them to the hospital and we bring them back. And then after being in that, or after being in this COVID quarantine for 180 days, we come in at 4 o'clock in the morning, flip the lights on, scream at them, run them out of the room, run them down the hallway. And when we run cattle fast or just at a trot, they go at about a 6.5 minute mile. When we walk them, they're at about an 18-minute mile. And people will be like, well, those cattle aren't going that fast. Just try to go run a 6.5 minute mile yourself. Maybe some of y'all can do it, but think about it after you've been in the situation that they've been in. Next slide. This is just to show you on the top. The green is regardless of whether these animals were on. First of all, the green is our blood samples, lactate levels of animals at the packing or at the feedlot prior to being shipped. These are normal lactate levels. The yellow are lactate levels in animals that presented at the packing plant normally. So they're walking normal, they're not tied up. And so we just took blood samples to see what their lactate levels would be. And so they do go up because of the hustle and bustle of moving them onto the trucks and moving them out of their home pen. And so we do have some muscular activity. But when we see these adverse events, these animals that tie up, and we see them in the summertime more frequently than we want to at packing plants, their lactate levels are 25 millimolars, and their CK levels, which is an indication of muscle damage, are 30 times higher than normal. And these are two things that are pathognomonic for this. Next slide. The big thing about this is the best way to prevent fatigue cattle syndrome when you're shipping these big cattle in the summer is to take your time. You can't control heat stress. Unfortunately, we can't control the time of day a lot of times that we ship. We can't control how big they're going to be right now, but we can control that we walk them to the loadout and we're very quiet getting them out of their pen. That has been the biggest thing that we have seen. The other thing that we have to work with at the plant when you weigh the cattle up is that when we looked at these pen scales that are long and narrow, the animals on the end can tend to get crushed because if you're standing at one end of the pen scale, and that can trigger some of these animals in exhaustion as well. And lastly, I'll say this. One of the biggest problems we have in animal welfare today is the length of times that animals stand on the truck at the plant prior to being unloaded. and we need the packer partners and the USDA to figure out a way that we can get these animals, when we show up, we can get them off the truck. When we look at hogs, when we look at chickens, they have shade set up for their trucks. They have fan banks to blow wind across there to lower the temperature within those trucks. We either need to have that system at our packing plants, or we need to work on logistics of getting them moved. Next slide. That's it for me. Larger cattle, long days on feed, increased dust, heat stress. We're going to see some AIP issues. We're going to see some lameness and some cattle breaking down on concrete because of the size of these animals. Be careful and watch for early lameness if you can, and then control what we can control. Making sure we have the proper trailers, making sure that we have the adaptations on the trailers, and making sure that we take our time to load those trucks and do a good job of getting them to the plant.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Thomson. One thing I do want to come back to in our question and answer and discussion is, one of the first strategies to manage cattle, heavy cattle, and get through this situation will be to sort pens or top out pens, and let's come back and talk a little bit about some of the issues you just mentioned and how we can manage that particular scenario with given the current environment.
You bet.
Okay, so let's move to our panelists. Today we have two panelists. Both are excellent nutritionists. We've relied on, had a really good discussion about corn co-products yesterday. Dustin Puhrmann is from Cooperative Farmers Elevator in Northwest Iowa. I should also mention that he's currently a board member with the Iowa Cattlemen's Association and is chairman of their feeder council. So very actively engaged with the Iowa Cattlemen's Association and leadership there. Dave Rueber is with Innovative Ag Services in Northeast Iowa, Eastern Iowa. And Dave has also been a former board member with the Iowa Cattlemen's Association and also the Iowa Beef Industry Council. And Dave covers a lot of the area in Eastern Iowa, works with a lot of feed yards in that area. So I'm going to start first, and I guess, Dave, let's start with you first. Why don't you just take a little time, introduce yourself, and talk a little bit about the business you work for and kind of what your trade area is.
Will do. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I would cover that east central Iowa area. I basically call it the nose of Iowa, Interstate 80 to the south, and basically Highway 3 to the north, and basically go to that Waterloo area to the west. A lot of farmer feeders in that area. Most of our feedlots would run from a couple hundred head to a couple thousand head. We do not have very many yards that are in excess of 5,000 head. I've been doing feedlot consulting for 29 years. I'm an Iowa State grad. If you'd have told me 29 years ago that I'd be on a webinar where we'd be talking about things we could do to slow down cattle performance, I would have said you were nuts. But we're kind of in some nutsy time frame and situation right now. So I guess we do some of these things on the fly and learn as we go. One of the things I wanted to make sure I talked about is, we're not proposing this slowing cattle and holding cattle back for everyone. Each feedlot situation is going to be unique. And each person will manage their own show list. And they'll be communicating with their fed cattle buyers so that they kind of know where they're at on the time frame that they're in. So that was kind of one thing I wanted to make sure I talked about on that end. I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dustin.
Okay, Dustin, yeah, you want to do the same? Give us a little background on you and your business and trade area.
Absolutely. I grew up here in Northwest Iowa, graduated out of Marcus in 1996, and then went on to South Dakota State for 5 years, where I got an animal science degree and a wife. So that was a good trip to Brookings. And since then, I'm back in the cooperative system in Northwest Iowa. I've been in nutrition for 18 years now. I currently work for Cooperative Farmers Elevator with 29 locations, and Iowa, Minnesota, and Southeast South Dakota. I'm one of 12 nutrition guys in the beef team. So we primarily work with farmer feeders. I would say that 80 to 90% of my business is feedlot, and the balance is cow-calf for the most part. And most of my clients that have of cows are mostly feedlot folks. So, yep, that's kind of where we're at up here.
Okay, sounds good. Dustin, while you've got the floor, what's the situation with your clients? What are you, and in terms of market access? You're in an area where a lot of those feed yards in Northwest Iowa are used to having 5 or 6 people out there bidding on cattle. What's kind of the pulse of the marketing situation with your clients?
Unfortunately, it's on the verge of being very dire, to be frank with you. Unfortunately, as you alluded to earlier in the presentation, packing capacity is about 80%. And unfortunately, our friends, formula traders in the South, have more or less filled the capacity of the packing plants, and the cash negotiated folks are filling in some left open spaces, which are very few. I've had clients that haven't had a bid for 4 to 5 weeks at this point, and it seems like the buyers have enough interest coming to the feed yards to kind of take care of the really big cattle that are in trouble, more or less. Buyers that can buy anywhere from 150 to maybe 600 head a week. And I've got a lot of guys that would like to market some cattle and get some cattle moved. So it's a very dire situation, I guess, at this point, looking forward.
Dave, Eastern Iowa, I know you've just had some plants that have been closed that have come back online. What's the situation over there? You got fewer buyers, but you do, you do have some good market access historically.
Yeah, we've kind of had a revolving case of plants going down. I'll kind of go through plant by plant. Aurora, just outside of Chicago, was shut down for a couple weeks. They opened back up again last week at limited capacity. They were processing cattle early this week, and then the word was they were going to shut down again. I did not hear definitive if they did or not, but they talked about that they would be shutting down again the end of this week. The Tyson plant in Joslin is running about 3,000 head a day today. They have the capacity to run, I believe it's 4,500, something like that. So you can do the math. They're somewhere around 60 to 70% of what they normally can run through. And then Dustin's probably more familiar than I am about Dakota City. They've kind of been an on again, off again here the last couple weeks. Tama, the national plant down in Tama, they were shut down for a week and a half. Came back online this week. I talked to a producer today that said they harvested about 1,000 head today. So they're not far from being back to what their normal harvest rates would be. It's difficult to say the least. I feed cattle myself, and I can go right along with what Dustin said. I've had cattle that I have tried to sell for 4 weeks and cannot get a bid. Now, for what it's worth, I had some cattle that I can put on a grid, and it seemed like, just like Dustin said, the formula cattle seem to be finding their way into the plants. And I would tell you, grid cattle seem like they were easier to get scheduled also. I don't know if that was just a hit and miss deal, but that was something we saw. Like this week, one of the regional plants came in and gave a pretty decent bid for some cattle on Monday, considering the situation, but they only offered that bid to some of their key accounts. So the person that markets 2 or 3 semi-loads a year to that plant wasn't going to be on their list, but some of the guys that market all their cattle through them and maybe thousands ahead seem to be the ones that got the phone call. I am optimistic that next week will be significantly better. That's the feedback we're getting back from the buyers, is that they think they're going to be able to bid again next week. And we went into April in pretty current conditions in Eastern Iowa. obviously the last 3 to 4 weeks have caused that currentness to go away. There wouldn't be, there's not hundreds of pens that are 1,600 pounds because you just don't have that size cattle over in this part of the world this time of the year. But we do have some folks that got some big cattle that they would have loved to have moved, but they can't. Those are the folks, obviously, we're trying to get them to the front of the list. To me, it's all about communication with those fed cattle buyers, letting them know what your situation is and prioritizing the pens that need to be prioritized.
Further comment, I guess, is that I had a client that corresponded with me on Tuesday, and one of the buyers came out and looked at the pen of heifers that he has for sale. And upon evaluation of the heifers, he told my customer to go call a different packer. They wasn't even interested. I think that causes an immense amount of frustration with what's going on in the country. And like Dave alluded to, we've got some guys that feed some yearlings over here that are trying to catch that March, April market to try and, fill that hole that, proverbial hole that we always seem to have about this time of year that drives the price a little bit. And, so they were trying to get some calf feds ready along with their big yearlings, and maybe they could lure some of them calf feds along with the yearlings to get, everything moved at once. And at this point, nothing's moved. So it's challenging to say the least.
Yeah. So Dustin, what kind of on a producer by producer basis, what are kind of your strategies that you're thinking about doing? It sounds like you're kind of haven't been to the point where you've really done drastic things, but what's going to trigger that? What things like feed availability, how heavy do the cattle have to be before you start really doing something more drastic? I mean, what's going through your mind right now and the minds of your clients as you discuss looking forward?
So as my clients get some bigger cattle around and they're concerned about days, I guess some of the things that I keep in my mind would be how long the cattle have been on feed. So rumen health is a key component to that. And the more days, the more opportunity they've had to be acidotic and, had some rumen challenges over those days. So that's definitely a concern going forward. Feed stuff that they have available. I sure wouldn't be opposed to those guys backing down a ration or so, just to get a little additional fiber in there. Maybe they eat the same amount of feed. I don't think I want to limit those cattle at all. I think that's going to create some other stress in the pen, just some social stress that we really don't want to tie into at this point. One of the things that I also think about is some of the work that got done down at K-State and Chris Reinhardt. And as he looked at the growth pattern of these cattle, especially at the end of their life, the majority of that weight goes into the carcass. So if we start looking at our feed cost to gain or our feed efficiency on a carcass basis, all of a sudden it's not quite as detrimental maybe as our overall feed efficiency. So I'm not really sure that I want to slow them down too much on the end. I may, pull back a ration to make sure I got plenty of fiber in there and kind of keep everybody in a better spot that way, just to eliminate, maybe some rumen stress and some laminitis and some of those types of things that can happen with long days on feed.
You mentioned, well, come back and ask the same question today, but I just want to follow up. You mentioned that you're not too excited about limit feeding, especially given bunk space that a lot of your clients might have. But what about like changing their bunk management slightly, going to more of a slick buck program than where they might be, or having more clean bunks per week than where they might be, which kind of effectively limits intake a little bit?
Yeah, I guess I would encourage most of my guys I teach to or advocate that we feed to a slick bunk for the most part, and try to use the bunk breeding stuff that Robbie taught up at South Dakota State for a number of years. I wouldn't have any problem like on the grower rations and on the higher roughage diets. I think we can, get away with some of those types of things, or or even if we get some cattle in those step-up diets, we could probably, figure out what it's going to take and limit feed those cattle so they gain, program them to gain 2.25, 2.5 pounds a day. It just depends on how many days you want to stretch them out. But once those cattle are on those finishing diets, I can't get excited about trying to slow them down, I guess. I think that they're still going to be efficient enough, and I think they're going to continue to grow, even if we pull them back a little bit on energy and give them a little more fiber in their diet. We're probably 4 or 5 weeks away. So, depending on the type and kind of cattle you have in your yard. So do you have the Angus steer that weighs 1,250 pounds, it's a yield grade 4 or 5? Or do you have the Angus steer in your yard that can weigh 1,600 and carry it well? I mean, those are definitely some things that we got to evaluate. And I think that the packers have been helping us a little bit with those, 1,200 pound steers are all yield grade 4s and 5s, and they're going to kind of let us feed those bigger frame cattle to a heavier weight just to kind of prolong or buy some time or whatever you want to say in the situation.
Dave, what are some of your considerations that you're thinking about and as you look through what your decisions your producers are going to be making here in the next days and weeks?
I'll add on with some of the things that Dustin talked about. I'm not a big fan of restricting the intakes big time as well. Riding issues can come into play there if we have some cattle that are a little irritable because our intakes are way back. One thing that some folks may consider, and this is something I have talked to some Elanco folks about, if you're feeding rumensin, potentially bumping that rumensin level by 3-4 grams. If you were running 26, 27, potentially running that up to 30 grams per ton and using that rumensin as possibly a tool to keep the intakes a little bit more in line without causing irritable cattle. That's a thought that requires bunk management and doing all the things that have to be done correctly in conjunction with that. Big thing, like Dustin said, prioritize the pens that need to be sold first. And obviously days on feed is the first thing you look at. I would do everything I could to avoid overfeeding the heifers and holding back heifers. Keep your steers if you need to. Those heifers, like Dr. Dan talked about there, those heifers just bring us more issues, more feet and leg issues, more interstitial issues. They can't get as big anyway. So if you've got multiple pens that you're trying to make decisions on, avoid holding the heifers. I would avoid pens that had previous health issues. You had a pen of cattle that you treated 20%, in their first 3-4 weeks in the feed yard. Those are cattle you probably prioritize to go to town sooner versus later. There's some cattle that may have some abscess issues going into some heat here. That's not cattle that you want to have any longer than you have to. Feet and leg problems, once that comes into play, and that can be foot rot issues, that can be hairy heel, some of those things. If you've got that going on, prioritize those pens, get them out of there. And a lot of this is common sense kind of stuff, but just be thinking in your mind, okay, of these 3 pens I got to sell, which one's the most important one I got to move? Another thing that I really like to follow is, most folks should be tracking what their dry matter intakes are. If you've got a pen of cattle that you're on a finishing ration and they're going along, and normally we will see intakes decrease as they get closer to finish. But if you have a pen that's dramatically dropping off on feed and you're not the one causing that, meaning they're just cattle that are dropping, those are probably cattle that I would prioritize as well. They are not going to be efficient. Now, if you're sitting on multiple pens and you've got a scenario where you may not have packers that are interested in the pen because they're just too big for them, you may want to help them with some decision making. And what I mean by that, if you've got a pen of 1,700 pounders and you have a pen right next to them that weighs 1,400 pounds, if you do the math, you can average those 2 pens down to 15.5 so that buyer doesn't get chewed out by his people above him. So be creative in some of those marketing deals so that you can keep those weights. You know, that's a buyer that we're going to be working with down the road. So we need to keep him out of trouble as well. You know, and I know it's hard right now to have good relationships with some of these guys in the packing industry. They have frustrated us beyond reason, but we need them right now. And chewing them out as much as we'd like to in a lot of situations, and between you and I and the 100 people listening here, they deserve every chew out they could get. You need that relationship right now, and you got to tell them what you got for head counts. You need to prioritize that stuff that, hey, this is a pen I can live with for a little while. This pen, you got to move me to the top of the list on kind of stuff, you know, and don't cry wolf on everything. You got to be straight up with them. And that's kind of where we're at. So I've been floundering here a little bit. I'll pass it back to Dan or Dustin.
No, that sounds good. And I've got more questions for you guys, but let's go ahead and, whoops, wrong way. Let's go ahead. I'm going to give Dr. Dan's talk again. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions from the people that are watching. Like, give them an opportunity to ask questions, and if I can get my questions in, we can do that as well. So here at the end, on the right, you see here's the instructions to ask the question. If you hover your mouse over the little bubble, that'll give you the chat box. The little question mark is the Q&A. You can use either of those, and we'll be monitoring those, and we'll respond to your questions through the chat. We did get one question earlier, and that's from Dr. Engelken. And it was about bunk space for limit feeding, and you guys kind of related to that. He says, if you have a pen of 1,300 to 1,400 pound steers, what would be the recommended bunk space for limit feeding? And you know, I think both of you guys would be really uncomfortable with limit feeding, but I guess my thought is that's not something you'd want to do in a confinement barn where you got 6 or 8 inches of bunk space. You definitely want to have more than a foot, and you'd want to do it in a way that you manage their intake. And you know, I think some of the studies where they've limited intake, and I wouldn't greatly limit intake. I'd do it more with the feed bunk management approach, and maybe feed twice a day and feed them closer together so that you take some of the edge off their appetite and use some of those bunk management strategies. I don't know if you guys have any additional comments to that, but I guess that might be one way I'd look at it.
Well, one of the things, this is Dan, and don't forget that I did do my degree in nutrition, even though I'm a veterinarian.
And you did that first, so we claim you first.
So I just drive up and down the road arguing with myself. But the one thing we did on these big cattle, and especially if you're gonna run them on a finished ration and you're not gonna limit them. Or if you do limit them, is have a hay truck or have something that you can knock the edge off the cattle. I know this sounds counterproductive, but it will not. It's hard to do. That's the reason why a lot of people don't want to do it. But our performance is not, in the studies we've done out in the field, we haven't negated it, but it will help with, especially this time of year with that spring pop and some of the intakes that these cattle are trying to climb to. You might do that just to knock some edge off of them.
Okay, here's a question from the on the chat box. I have some 100-day fed calves scheduled to go in June, getting 4 pounds of alfalfa now in a 63 megacal ration. The question, which is pretty typical, question is, will backing down to 55 or 58 hold carcass quality? My response to that is, you know, as long as you're gaining enough to deposit, you're going to continue to deposit marbling if they're gaining weight at least 2.5 pounds a day. It'll be slower because your rate of gain slower, but that's kind of what the research shows. I don't know what Dave or Dustin, if you have observations from the field on that.
Bill, my observation on that would be that you're probably gonna get along just fine. You're probably gonna have a little bit higher feed conversion on the lower energy diet. You'll have a little more safety on that lower energy diet. So I guess I would expect that the cattle are probably going to eat a few more pounds of the 58 versus the 63. Will probably be your main difference, and your daily gain I would expect to be, somewhat similar. So
here's a question that it goes back to what I wanted to revisit with your talk, Dr. Dan. Is it worth the stress to sort a load out of a pen to get a few gone when you may get the whole load sold in another week or two?
Yeah, so it's a question we get a lot, and when we sort, our numbers show that every time we sort, we gain about $15 a head. When we sort at reimplant, when we sort later, it costs us about $5 a head just in decreased intakes and things to that, but and stress on the animals. But I would say that that it's a common practice, and to get a load out, I would top my pins off and to have more current marketings. The other thing is that you have to think about selling them all. And I didn't want to say this tonight, but I think I have to, is that as I talk with people in this disease in the humans, this may not be our only slowdown or only time that we see this in the plants. The plants may go through this again, later this summer or in the fall. And so I think that when we have a chance to get cattle out, we need to get cattle out. But if you're going to sort, obviously you have to use good cattle handling techniques, and you have to move them quietly out of the pen, because if you get into these things where we have cattle running all over the place and it's hot, we'll run right into some of the issues that we talked about earlier.
Great, good comments there. And you guys kind of talked about this, but very specific question here, and I think you kind of answered it, but give you a chance to revisit it. Do you think limit feeding will create some social problems in the pens, i.e., bunk hogs, more shy cattle not getting what they need? And I think Dave and Dustin, that's your main concern, correct?
I'm not a fan of the behavioral problems you can have from restricted intake.
I think there's a couple of things on that one, when you start to think about heifers and restricted intake, the time that we see it, whenever someone comes in and tells me the MGA quit working, it's usually during heat stress, and some of our intakes go down, or some of the animals don't eat, and so they don't get adequate levels of MGA. And you come in on a cool morning and they're riding each other, and we can have some issues there as well.
There's another question, and this is one I was going to ask earlier, so I'm glad they asked it, or a related question. Would you be worried about riding with backing off energy on aggressive implant strategy? Should we be going to a more moderate implant strategy, or should we change our implant strategy if we're trying to slow the cattle technologies to make cattle grow? If we're trying to slow them down, it's kind of working against us. So what's your guys' thoughts on that question?
Well, I don't know that we change anything unless we have to. One of the previous questions on some 100-day calves, I'd be rolling along as normal with those cattle, and making sure I was maybe putting cattle on a show list a little bit soon to handling that. Sometimes we may end up creating more problems just by making changes because what might happen. So let's make our management decisions based on what we know. And the things I know is if I back cattle up, I know for a fact my cost to gain is going to go higher. If I back cattle up, I know for a fact my break even is going to be higher. I don't know if I'm going to go into a better or worse market. Some folks I think are going, well, I'm going to back them up so that maybe I can get away from this thing. And my answer to that is, you may put those cattle right into the low of the year. You don't know. I don't know. None of us know. So, if you're midway through the feeding period, I think you keep going along as you planned on with things.
I guess my take on the implant issue is, I would advocate that if you're gonna back up one diet on those finishing cattle. If you're on a 63, go to 61. You normally finish on a 61, maybe 59, 40, or 58, somewhere in there. I don't want to see it make a big drastic change. I mean, it's just it's a small change, and whether those cattle are on a 58 or 61, and the intake is there, I think your high potency implants are going to be fine through this, and I don't think you're going to have much issue there. But you know, it's about consistency and those and feed deliveries and those types of things. So make sure your dry matter's hanging together if you do decide to back up. Don't get wild, I guess. Don't drop from, you know, a 63 down to a 55 or something like that. I mean, keep them on a good finishing diet. And I think you'll be just fine there.
So here's a question that I want to get your input on, and it alludes to the article that we wrote with our colleagues in Wisconsin, and there was mention of Holsteins in there, and the strategies might be different with Holsteins, and our thoughts there was that, you know, Holsteins are different biologically just because they eat more feed, and their feed efficiency really plummets even to a greater degree than beef cattle at those heavier weights. But I guess I'd like to get your thoughts on how these ideas might differ with Holsteins based on your experiences.
We've had a lot of Holsteins in western Iowa and southwest Minnesota before the whole price debacle, you know, a couple of years ago. And for the most part, we fed those cattle aggressively on the front end of their life, more moderately in the middle, and then we kind of ramped them back up and finished them hard, and seen that we had good gut health that way, and performance was good that way. So I guess I don't think I would probably change them a whole lot. I think the same strategies apply whether they're beef or Holsteins. Ultimately, they're for making milk and not meat. I think that's really the only difference, and most of them are a lot more friendly and you know, less likely to kill you.
I would only add, just if you can get a little bit of extra effective fiber in there, if there's the ability to put some ground hay or some ground corn stalks, so that, you know, you've got that instead of, you know, maybe all your roughage coming from a corn silage or an earlage type thing. That effective fiber would, just a little bit of that goes a long way.
Okay, time's getting short. Dan, were you going to say something?
Well, we feed a lot of Holsteins in our yards, and we will run 2x the digestive death loss in Holsteins as what we will colored cattle, regardless of pretty much what we do. And I think that's something to keep in mind.
So our time's short, and this hour's gone really, really fast. I know it's 8 o'clock right now, but I think we'll take one more question, and then we'll kind of wrap it up for the night. And you folks that are out there, you know, send us your questions. You continue to type them in the chat box. I promise you we'll respond to them. We'll put a Q&A up on our website, let you know where it is, and we'll answer all your questions that you have to the best of our ability. But the question that we have here is that with long-fed cattle and the implants running out, what impact might that have on yield grade the longer the implant has run out, and would you grid those cattle? That's a really good question. And so I might let Dr. Dan tackle that one first and get Dustin and Dave's thoughts, because that's actually what Dr. Dan did his thesis research on, as I recall.
I actually looked at implanting 3 and 5 weeks prior to slaughter in my dissertation, and that's what I was going to recommend. Just these cattle are so big, they're hard to get through the chute, and so that's the hardest part about. But if you look at Brad Johnson's research for maximum performance, we should be re-implanting every 45 to 60 days. But I think that one of the things that when we start to think about implants in the end of the feeding period, if we don't have an understanding, it's going to be hard to feed that beta agonist, because you don't know which cattle are going to get to go and when they're going to go. And so maybe some later date implanting with another terminal implant will be necessary, just like we do on some Mexican cattle, and just like we do on some Holsteins that are longer day. You know, they'll get 3 implants. And I wanted to mention one more thing, Dan, before I sign off. is that if you put shade up this summer, because you're going to have a bunch of big cattle, and Dustin and Dave both alluded to this on foot rot. If you don't put up enough shade and you don't put it up to where the shade moves during the day, the worst foot rot wrecks I've seen are in some of the most arid conditions because people put up postage stamp shades. You get these big cattle huddling underneath there, urinating in the same spot every day, creating a mud hole, and we get terrible foot rot issues. So just be careful with that as well.
So Dustin, Dave, we'll give you a chance for any final comments, and then we'll wrap it up for this evening, if you have any.
On the implant deal, running out at the end, you're probably your biggest hit's gonna be on feed conversion. You're not gonna affect grade at all, and it just depends on how many days after you run out, how far you feed them. You're gonna have to have some visual evaluation and appraisal of the cattle, and hopefully they're not all 4s and 5s at that point, and that's going to be your deciding factor on whether they need to go on a grid or if they need to be sold flat.
Excellent. Dave, any parting words?
Yeah, just some things out there. Some of these long day cattle, we talked about it briefly before. If at all possible, sell those cattle on a yield basis. Their yields are going to be pretty phenomenal. A, it's that time of year. B, they're big cattle, like we talked about. It goes to carcass. So if you can sell on yield versus live, it will probably be beneficial to you. Second, Dr. Dan talked about beta agonist. Love Optiflex as a product. It's pretty difficult to manage right now unless you can get some certainty on your delivery dates. That's a technology that you may not be able to use as much as you've used in the past, or, there's some different things we can do with Optiflex usage as far as not being our optimal 28 to 35 days. You may have a packer that'll work with you on a 21-day schedule, for example, and you may just wait until you get a firm date and then start putting that Optiflex in there. Otherwise, boy, we've had some folks that have had it in the ration and we've had to pull it back out, and then we got to make a decision. Do we put it back in, and when do we put it back in? A great technology, but kind of tough to manage right now. So you need as much information as you can if you're going to use that.
Excellent comments, great information. I really appreciate all the panelists here tonight. It's a lot of good information. And so I guess just as kind of a few parting words, I think the best advice that we could have given you tonight is work with your nutritionist. They know your feedstuffs, they know your management, they can help guide you through the strategies to do this. I'd also say that our extension beef field staff are there. There's their contact information, so be sure, and if you're in Iowa, look at who your regional beef specialist is. They're many of them are trained in nutrition as well, and they're there to help you, and they're kind of our lifeline between the beef industry locally and what we do here on campus. Our campus specialists with Iowa Beef Center are listed here, and feel free to contact us with any questions that you might have, any feedback, and our job is to provide research-based information and education to you as well. Once again, I want to thank the Iowa Cattlemen's Association, the Iowa Beef Industry Council for partnering with us on this event. I think it's been a great partnership, and if you have ideas on the next, other information related to this or other issues, be sure and put that in the survey that you're going to be asked to fill out when you exit the webinar. So be sure and fill that out. That's the way that it helps us help you. The recordings will be shown at the link that you see there, and tell your neighbors about it and make sure that they view this as well. So with that, thank you, and we'll see you next time.